Okay, so let's get into the class itself. Okie dokie. So, physiology, which, ology study, it's kind of a weird one, study of nature. What is physiology actually? What are we studying in this class?
The function of the human body.
Yes, this is going to be like the study of the function. But obviously studying the function isn't going to be very easy unless you know how the things are put together and how they interact. It's like you can't study how an engine works if you don't know about cylinders and pistons and valves and this and that. So this is going to also involve anatomy, right? The study of the structure. People talk about the complementarity of structure and function. Right. We're not going to be able to talk about how the heart works if we don't talk about the atria and the ventricles and the valves and things like that are an integral part of how the heart pumps the blood around. The difference between anatomy and physiology and the way we teach it in these classes is in anatomy, you focused much more on the structure. You talked about function. It's kind of a functional anatomy class. It would be really boring to just describe ventricles and atria and name all the parts and pieces of a heart and never mention that, oh, by the way, the heart's job is pumping the blood around, right? So you talk about function, but it's kind of not the main focus. The focus is what are a million little names for every little part and piece of everything. In physiology, I'll have to get into some of the basic anatomy because otherwise we're not going to be able to talk about the physiology, but we're going to focus in on this function. And like I mentioned a few moments ago, we're also going to be looking at the function at a much deeper level, down at the level of, atoms and molecules in a way that you don't at all in anatomy. In fact, the whole idea of, levels of organization, right? The chemical level, where you have a kind of atoms and molecules, and then to the cells, the basic units of life, and then to tissues, which are kind of groups of cells that have a common function, and tissue. What happens if you have more than one tissue making a structure with a particular function?
Organ.
And we have organs. And then we get into organ systems. And finally, like the organism, which is like you. When you're in anatomy, you kind of talk about cells a bit, you really start honing in on tissues, histology. You learn about all the tissues and put them together. So in your class in anatomy, you're going to be focusing really from here up. In our class, this physiology class, we're going to, in fact, the first month of the class, we're not even going to get past the chemical and cellular level. We're going to really be honing in down here and what's going on. And then we'll be putting these together to make the rest of the parts and pieces. But again, we're not going to get to our first organ system till the second month of the class. So we're going to finally kind of introduce the nervous system. That be said, I should also mention the idea of organ systems is pretty artificial, right? It's a useful way to kind of keep everything from happening at once when you're trying to learn it. But in reality, everything is happening at once in your body. When we're trying to learn the cardiovascular system, The main thing that controls your kind of resting state blood pressure is actually your urinary system. Your water volume, your kidneys are integral parts of your cardiovascular system. Your nervous system is an integral part of controlling your cardiovascular system. The endocrine system is an integral part of controlling your cardiovascular system. All of these things are really entangled and entwined in these really deep ways. So we will be talking about organ systems because it is a useful way to kind of focus in, but be aware that it's a pretty artificial construct, that organ systems really are not independent. And a lot of these organ systems are very intimately involved in each other's businesses as we've defined them. So putting that out there. I can talk about teleology versus mechanistic. Okay. So teleology, this is about like the why. Why is it like that? What's it doing? Mechanistic is just kind of describe what is happening. So for instance, sweating. Sweating is a perfect example of, why do we sweat? We have a pretty good idea of why sweating is useful. It's helping with evaporative cooling to help with our homeostasis for temperature. If we're getting too hot, we can sweat, and the evaporating sweat cools us down, brings our temperature back down. So sweating makes sense in a why kind of point of view. Mechanistically, we could also look at sweating in terms of the activation of these little sweat glands and how they're producing their stuff and what's triggering them and this and that. As when possible, I will bring in like, why does this make sense? Like, this is what's happening and this is why it seems to be this way. There are going to be times when we don't know why. There's a bunch of stuff, something as simple as fever. We're going to be able to describe from a mechanistic standpoint of how fever works. There's going to be these signaling molecules released by white blood cells when they're fighting infections that go talk to your hypothalamus and reset your, basically your body's thermostat. But like, why is that good? Why is that happening? There are different theories, depending on which book you read, they might have some other why that they think that makes sense. But I've never read something quite as like obvious, like sweating cools you off. That one, you don't have to convince me. That makes like some deep intuitive sense. You sweat to cool down. But like you get a fever to, how exactly is that helping your body in its fight against this invader, this pathogen? There are some reasons why that might be helpful or useful, but it's not quite as obvious. So just putting that out there. Some other things will describe like, why is it like that? It's like, because, I don't know, that's what it is. Sometimes things are that way because of the just evolutionary history. When we look at, cellular respiration, why is it so complicated and wonky and indirect? To go from a sugar molecule to get to ATP, we're gonna spend an entire lecture talking about the steps to break down sugar to make ATP. It's really like lots and lots of obscure things going on. And my basic thinking about it is, it works. Over the evolution of animals, things kind of layered on top of other things. And it didn't matter if it was the most efficient or if it was like the most beautiful engineering, it just had to work. And if it worked well enough, then those animals pass their genes on. So sometimes there's going to be stuff, it's just, why is it that way? You know, you can guess, you can hypothesize, but you can speculate, or there are people who speculate, but don't necessarily expect there to be a definitive answer. Let's see. Should also mention back here, I'm going to do my best to stay focused, help you remember there's an organism, right? We're going to be spending the first month, again, just down in here. But again, to understand, why does Xanax help you relax, you know, or Valium or something, you have to understand it at the level of atoms and molecules interacting with each other and how they have an effect on a particular cell. You know, and I'll do my best to kind of keep these connected, but you know, sometimes when we are just getting into the weeds, so to speak, I do want you to kind of try to remember that this class really is about human physiology, even when we seem like we're getting lost in the weeds of atoms and electrons. We ultimately are going to be putting it all together to understand, you know, how the body is doing what it does. What else? Oh, can also just mention the basic tissue types, because we'll be going into them in a little more detail. Again, if you've been in anatomy, you've done tissues out the wazoo, but I will just review briefly. Again, tissues are just a bunch of cells that are all kind of working together for a kind of very common function. Right. People who've been in anatomy, what are our basic tissue types?
Connective.
So connective tissue,
Muscle.
muscle. But wait, there's more.
Skeletal.
Skeletal.
Which
That's part of connective, skeletal, the bones.
yeah, skeletal is connective.
Adipose.
Adipose is also connective.
Cardiac? No, that's muscle.
It's muscle. There's two more.
Epithelial.
Epithelial. In fact, epithelial is going to be the one that we look at in a lot of detail, because epithelial tissues are what are creating the boundary between the inside and the outside of you, either where you kind of control what manages to get in or out, or what crosses from the lumen of your intestine and gets absorbed into your bloodstream. So we're going to be spending a lot of time looking at epithelial tissues, talking about transepithelial transport. How can you intentionally pull something across from one side of an epithelial sheet to the other, but leave other things that you don't want to move? So epithelial sheets, epithelium, are going to be important in our class. We'll look at these in quite a bit of detail. And again, because they are the things that are creating the boundaries between what's inside, what's you and what's not you, so to speak. Muscle tissue we'll also be spending quite a bit of time looking at. Again, muscle, somebody mentioned cardiac. There's also skeletal muscle, which is most of your voluntary muscles that move your body around, smooth muscle that is more involuntary, like changing the diameter of your blood vessels or the diameter of your pupil, things like that. Connective, we're not going to talk about that much. Connective is, except for blood. Blood's a connective tissue. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about blood. But in general, we're not going to be getting so deep into connective tissue in this class.
Nervous tissue.
Nervous.
And there's nervous tissue, which we will also talk a lot about. We'll talk a bunch. We're going to talk about neurons at a much greater depth than you talked about in anatomy, as well as the glial cells that support them. So just kind of making sure you remember the basic tissues. The other concept, again, that is not new, I'm sure, to you at all, but is going to be really kind of at the bottom of a lot of what we do in this class, is homeostasis. So it's worth talking about explicitly right now. What is homeostasis?
Balance.
Balance, equilibrium.
So it's definitely that's part of it.
Or bringing back to neutral.
Right. And it's basically kind of maintaining a stable internal environment in your body. Making sure the pH of everything stays at the target of like around 7.4, making sure that your blood sugar stays in its target around 100, what is it, milligrams per, I forget what it is now, making sure that your temperature stays around 97, whatever, making sure that your blood pressure stays in the zone to keep the blood moving, but not popping your vessels. There's lots of things going on that are trying to maintain this kind of stable kind of set point. Was it Claude Bernard? He was the one who is kind of famous for, it's French, so it's tricky to say. I hear. La fixité de milieu intérieur est la condition de la vie libre et indépendante. So basically, it's like the stability of the internal environment is a condition for a free and independent life, right? So we can like zip around and live in all sorts of environments, but we have all of these processes going on to make sure that inside our body, things are staying in the optimal zones and values, no matter what's going on outside our body. A lot of disease processes happen when there is a disruption of homeostasis. So we're going to talk quite a bit about what are the processes that help you maintain homeostasis, and then also what can go wrong when that is not being maintained. Homeostasis in general is maintained by what we call negative feedback. So let me talk about negative feedback. So the basic idea here is there is some variable. It might be, blood sugar. It might be your body temperature. It might be your pH. It's something that you care about. It has some value that has some optimal range that it should be at. And negative feedback, if there is a change in the variable, it results in a response that opposes that change. So if your blood sugar is dropping, you are going to release some of the stored sugar from your liver and bring your blood sugar back up. If your blood sugar is spiking, you're going to release insulin and tell your cells to take up sugar and get it out of your bloodstream and bring it back down. If your body temperature is dropping, you might start shivering to warm up. If your body temperature is getting too high, you're going to start sweating, cool down to bring your body temperature back down. So that's what I mean by negative feedback. There's a response that will oppose the change. If it goes up, the change will try to bring it back down. If it goes down, the response will try to bring it back up. This is by far the most common. We'll see lots and lots of examples of negative feedback. Just for completeness, any question? This makes sense. This is like, the classic thermostat in your house is negative feedback. If your temperature is going up in your house, the air conditioner goes on and cools you off, assuming you don't like San Francisco. I never had an air conditioner, but I think in Marin they have air conditioners. And if your temperature of the house is dropping down, the heater turns on and it warms you up, right? So you oppose the change by doing the appropriate response. Two other things that we will see that are not as common, but we should mention, there is positive feedback. This is rare, but it exists. So this is response will increase the change. So examples where we're going to see this is like in blood, in hemostasis. If you have a rip in your blood vessel, you're going to have platelets that are going to start sandbagging the area, and they're going to release molecules that attract more platelets. So even more platelets will come in and sandbag, and they'll release things that attract even more platelets. So you start getting this positive feedback thing where you start with just a few platelets that are grabbing on, trying to stop the leak, but they're causing a big dogpiling of more and more platelets to keep you from bleeding out. Obviously there's got to be a stop to it, because obviously you don't just keep going until everything is all clogged up. Childbirth is a positive feedback loop. When you start going into labor, you release oxytocin. Oxytocin causes uterine contractions. And as you get deeper into labor, the contractions cause even more oxytocin release, which causes even stronger contractions, which causes even more oxytocin release, which causes even stronger contractions. And that can go on for like hours or day. And eventually, there's an end to that where the baby pops out. So rare, but we will see it sometimes, positive feedback. Feed forward is another thing we'll see. Right, let me spell anticipate change. So feed forward is when a change hasn't happened yet, but there is evidence that something is going to happen. So let's preemptively have a response. This is kind of like a preemptive response. Right. I'm worried that country is going to attack me, so I'll just bomb them to dust before they ever have a chance, right? That's a feed forward. Your digestive system has feed forward, like just thinking about food. They call it the cephalic phase of gastric secretion. Just having some yummy food on the plate, you are getting ready to eat it, it's gonna actually start the secretion of acids and stuff into your stomach before anything's ever gotten into your mouth. You know, if you actually are thinking that you're gonna eat a lemon, like right now, if you just imagine chewing on a lemon, you're gonna actually probably notice that there's saliva there's more saliva in your mouth than there was a moment before, because your body's gonna start like getting this saliva to kind of protect your teeth from the acid, right? So feed forward is anticipate the change, have a preemptive response before something even has happened in the first place. And so we'll see some examples of this as we go on as well.
So negative and positive are always literal quantitative changes. Negative feedback would be a decrease in something. Positive feedback would be an increase in something.
Or I'd say, no, oppose the change. Like a negative feedback could be an increase. Like if your temperature is dropping, the response is going to be to bring the temperature back up. Right? So negative means it's the opposite sign of whatever direction the change was. But if the change was negative, then the response will be positive. If that makes sense.
Gotcha. So just opposing.
Opposing, yes. Right. Yeah. Again, if you think about the thermostat example, if the temperature is dropping, the heater will turn on to increase the temperature. But if the temperature is too high, you'll turn on the air conditioner, which is actually going to lower the temperature. But those are both examples of two sides of negative feedback, always opposing the change. So